Well, here we are, July 8th, 2022. I'm Larissa, and today I am making some raviolis, and my dough is resting right now. So I thought maybe I would sit down and read the next chapter of my cookbook, In My Kitchen on My Table, Lenten Tales of Culinary Traditions. Chapter 6, Masa Bread, Chili, and Tamales. It can be argued that corn is the most controversial food crop on the planet. Corn, as we know and love it today, is a much different plant than it once was, or may become. Corn is actually a grass, and one of the few families of plants that is indigenous to all continents. Because of this amazing grain, human civilization is what it was yesterday, is today, and will be tomorrow. From an anthropological standpoint, it is the cultivation, domestication, and modifying of this plant that has driven all cultures and societies. Corn has fed humans and livestock and is what facilitated us as a species to turn away from the hunter-gatherer model of existence. Farming of the crop has driven innovations such as irrigation systems, infrastructure such as roads, and domestication of animals such as bovine, pigs, and fowl. Nowadays, corn is even a source of fuel and materials, but it has come at a great cost that is debated and disputed back and forth between scientists, business, governments, and consumers the world over. The biggest issues have come since the advent of genetic engineering of crops. Since the dawn of domesticated agriculture, genetic modification has been part of the equation. Selective breeding through selection of seeds from the most successful of plants and intentional cross-pollination of varietals is what has changed crops such as corn and every other farmed plant, especially after the discoveries of Gregor Mendel and his infamous pea plants. But farmers had been modifying plants long before Mr. Mendel. Genetic engineering is something else altogether. To simply modify a plant through intentional cross-pollination and selective seed banking still allows the plant to arrive at maturation through natural means. Birds and pollinator species were busy at work doing such modification, albeit randomly, long before humans tried their hand at it. Genetic engineering alters the plant at the level of the plant's DNA, and that is only possible through scientific intervention in laboratory settings. These processes have been marketed to the masses as necessary to feed coming generations due to global climate change, but these practices have in large part been a driving force behind global climate change, as well as the annihilation of the family farm. Ultimately, the goal of genetically engineered crops is to be able to patent genetics so companies can sue anyone who grows seeds containing the patented genetics if they have not purchased the seeds from the company or one of the company's distributors. It is not to ensure there's enough food to go around. In fact, ownership in this context creates an unfair playing ground where companies, i.e. a small group of individuals, hold the control of entire food sources and, as such, the life and livelihood of all peoples on the planet. For decades now, there has been this problem. One farmer buys GE seeds from a company and plants them in their fields. Those plants cross-pollinate via wind, birds, and pollinator species such as bees with a neighboring farmer's heirloom species that have been grown from that farmer's personal seed bank. The resulting new crop holds patented genetics. The company that owns the genetics comes through and takes samples, finding their genetic property growing on the property of a farmer that has not purchased their seeds. And so they sue them. The results are, most often, that the unsuspecting farmer is forced out of business and ends up selling their land and other property at way below market value just to survive. In addition to these issues, there's the problem of propagation. Most frequently, GE crops are specifically modified to produce non-viable seed, meaning the crop that sprouts from the purchased seed is sterile. So the cross-pollination of GE crops with heirloom or simply GM crops renders the supply of heirloom and or GM crop barren. A farming family that has spent their entire career, that may have spanned decades and generations, has their entire legacy destroyed in just a couple seasons. Whether or not a crop is weather resistant was a moot point before, because farmers worked with the natural cycles and seasons, and people understood how to save, preserve, and prepare foods and food products at home, relying on themselves and their property to feed themselves, not companies. The introduction of genetic engineering has made it almost impossible for a person to feed themselves. Once a company creates such reliance, a subtle but powerful form of slavery is enacted upon all. Corn was once a diverse species of plant. That diversity is now all but destroyed, and with its destruction, we as a species have brought ourselves and our planet into great peril. The crop that once allowed for growth of civilization is now poetically on the front lines of destroying civilization. In addition to the obliteration of biodiversity among the crop itself, there have been many unanticipated effects upon other species and creatures in our planetary web of coexistence. When the conquistadors returned to Europe, they brought with them strange tales of the eating habits of the peoples they encountered in the New World, in particular the use of corn and potatoes as staple foods for people in New World diets. Such foods were not entirely unknown to the conquistadors, but they were reserved in Europe largely for the feeding of livestock. This perception is in large part what fueled the view of New World peoples as savages compared to Europeans. It was not the color of their skin. Europeans, particularly the Spanish and Portuguese, were very familiar with peoples with darker complexions, having been engaged in trade and religious disputes with the Turks and Moors and other groups from Africa and along the Silk Route. Inevitably, these same conquistadors and the settlers who came after them were forced of necessity to add both corn and potatoes to their diets in order to survive, and the crops eventually found their way into the mainstream diets of Europeans as well. Generations of genetic modification and now genetic engineering has had huge impact on the propagation of cultural diversity on the American continents. When most people hear about foods such as masa, chili, or tamales, they associate them with Mexican food. This is not entirely accurate. Corn and chilies as staple foods is American in that almost all of the peoples encountered by the conquistadors and the settlers that came after them in North, Central, and South America cultivated and consumed these foods. These foods are native foods of the Americas, not only Mexico. What makes a food specific to a region comes from what species of crop was indigenous to the region. Much like grapes and wine in Europe, corn and peppers, chilies, vary greatly from region to region, town to town, community to community, tribe to tribe. So what does any of this have to do with Lent? Well, everything and nothing at the same time. Growing up, corn wasn't directly a huge part of what was on my plate. My dad made huge bags of popcorn when we went to the drive-in, and we ate corn on the cob during the summer. Of course, there are plenty of tales of the sweet corn my pappy's family grew on their farm. Corn and tomatoes were their cash crops, but they grew lots of other veggies for personal consumption and farm stand sales, including but not only cabbage, onions, and peppers. The story I was told as a child about why my great-grandfather sold the farm was sugar-coated. It just wasn't profitable anymore, and he was too old. But the story is much more than that. As a young woman, my pappy explained it all to me. Heinz Corporation wanted to buy my great-grandfather's tomatoes, but he wouldn't sell them to them because they were known to allow crops to rot in the fields, to drive up costs for the competitors, and leave local peoples hungry. My great-grandfather refused to participate. He had left Italy to escape Mussolini's fascism or being drawn into organized crime. He wasn't interested in corporate gangsters either. My great-grandmother, Angelina, was locally known for her tomato ketchup, among other homemade products she sold. Heinz eventually pushed my great-grandparents out of business and stole my great-grandmother's ketchup recipe. The Morrow Farm was the third largest farm in the county at that time, covering over 200 acres. Once they went under, the other two went under as well, and the entire area was developed into the Pittsburgh suburb now known as Monroeville. I refused to purchase Heinz products on principle. My grandfather explained all this to me bitterly after I called him to tell him about a documentary I had watched called The Future of Food in the early 2000s. I told him Omar and I were interested in planting an organic garden and buying food from organic farms. He scoffed, telling me in my day we just called it farming. The phone conversation went on for over 2 hours, and when we were done, I understood the Morrow Farm hadn't just been organic, it had been biodynamic. His father had even said no to DDT being used on his property. At the time, Omar and I were living in Santa Rosa, California, and had purchased our first home. Santa Rosa is an old agricultural community, culturally best known for wine, but with a long history of apples and stone fruit, berries, and hops. The famous horticulturalist Luther Burbank called Santa Rosa home. His family house and grounds are a museum and local tourist attraction. My pappy scoffed at the name of Luther Burbank. He found much of his innovations to be nothing special that weren't already being done on farms in Pennsylvania at the time. And Burbank's over-association with communists was distasteful to my pappy's sensibilities as a humble and decorated World War II veteran. My nose is itching me again. Why? After this particular conversation with my pappy, I mailed him a copy of my favorite book, To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck. He called me back a week later to tell me he had read the entire book cover to cover the day it arrived. I could hear tears in his voice as he thanked me for sharing it with him and called me his farm girl. The initial conversation took place around Palm Sunday, and the entire experience spurred me to learn more about agriculture in and around Santa Rosa. You can't interact with agriculture in Santa Rosa without coming into contact with corn, not because they grow so much of it there, but because the majority of agricultural workers in all of California are of Central or South American heritage. The diet of peoples with such heritage is heavy in corn and corn products. La Tortilla Factory is located in Santa Rosa, so a large amount of the commercial tortillas sold at supermarkets come from Santa Rosa. I spent much of my time, when not in my own studio, garden, or kitchen, doing volunteer work. It is not work I would ever do again, given the subterfuge and lies I encountered in the groups I was involved with. But I did get an education that could never have been purchased anywhere, particularly about indigenous American foods and culture. Growing up, my mother made chili and cornbread. My mother's chili was sweet and meat-based. She would brown ground beef with onion, garlic, herbs, and spices, and add red kidney beans, diced tomato, and bell peppers and simmer. The dish was served over a mound of mashed potatoes and a side of jiffy cornbread. It was awesome. My maternal grandmother enjoyed my mother's chili and also enjoyed corn a whole lot. There were many nostalgic stories of sweet corn from the Morrow Farm, as well as the grits her mother and grandmother made for her for breakfast when she was a small child. It was my grandmother who taught me the difference between hominy and corn. They come from the same family, but are different plants. Working at the Coney Island, chili was another thing altogether. It was Coney Island brand, and it came in carefully labeled cans and bags. The meat and sauce were proprietary and contained large amounts of beef heart and suet. The beans were separate, an option served on top of the bowl. Visiting my in-laws when they lived in Cincinnati, Ohio, I was introduced to the famous Cincinnati chili, but to be honest, it wasn't all that memorable to me. I can't even tell you what it tasted like. Living in Santa Rosa and spending much time with the Spanish-speaking community there, I learned a lot about corn, chilies, foods, and techniques associated with Mexican restaurants. I learned that jiffy cornbread, while it was indeed tasty, is not anything like authentic masa. No one ever gave me their recipe. I only ever tasted other women's breads and tortillas, but I have taught myself how to make masa based on my experience and taste buds. Masa is the name of the flour made from a blend of corns and hominy. It is used to make tortillas, bread, masa, thicken soups, stews, and sauces, and make tamales. Tamales are made across the southwest and southern United States, as well as in Central and South America, because corn is and was a staple food for all American indigenous cultures. Almost. The techniques, flavors, fillings, varietals of corn and hominy, and chilies used vary depending on the region a person comes from. Different chilies and corn grow in different places and are influenced by elevation, seasonal cycles of rain and heat, and mineral content of the soil. I listened to two women argue once about what made a pot of chili a pot of chili. Did it need beans or meat? I laughed to myself as I thought, neither. It must have chilies. But first things first, masa bread. So this is how I make it. Scratchy, scratchy. Ingredients: 3 fresh eggs, 1 1/4 cup whole milk, 1/3 cup vegetable oil. Traditionally, this is made using lard, and that is very delicious, but this is for Lent, and I am predominantly lacto-ovo-vegetarian, so I use vegetable oil. 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda, 1 teaspoon of baking powder, 1 teaspoon of salt, 3 tablespoons sugar or honey, 1/3 cup of cotija, Mexican cheese, enough masa flour, probably a little over 2 cups, Pam cooking spray, 1 tablespoon ground chilies, optional, 1/4 cup frozen corn, optional. In a large mixing bowl, whisk together the milk, oil, eggs, salt, sugar, or honey. Preheat your oven to 425 degrees Fahrenheit and spray a loaf-sized baking dish with Pam. Add the baking powder and baking soda to the forming batter. Now start adding the masa a 1/4 cup at a time and stir well, allowing the batter to sit for 30 seconds or so between addition of flour. This is because the flour will take a few seconds to soak up the liquid and can become too stiff if you add it all at once. The amount of flour you need will vary depending on how fine it has been ground, the humidity in your kitchen, and the freshness of the masa. You want the batter to be the consistency of a thick cake batter. Now stir in the cotija cheese. Cotija is sold in a brick and needs to be crumbled before you use it. If you decide to add ground chilies or whole corn, this is also when you add it. If you use ground chilies, be sure they are ground fairly fine. If the batter seems too stiff, add a couple more tablespoons of milk and stir well. Spread the batter into the pan you sprayed with Pam and bake for 33 minutes or until the knife comes out clean in the center test. Allow it to cool before cutting into squares. This recipe makes 8 servings of bread. Okay, there you have it, masa bread. It's very different from the cornbreads, hot or cold water, you might find in American soul food kitchens and eateries. This is because masa flour is made largely of ground hominy rather than corn. Hominy grains are much larger, not quite as sweet as corn, and have a denser texture. Masa bread is cornier tasting than cornbread. Hominy-based flours were probably more common in early days of colonial and formerly united American states than it is today. So now let's move on to a hotter or sweeter topic, chilies. A chili is a dried or otherwise cured pepper. It can be hot or sweet. Drying and or smoking are preservation techniques that were imperative before the invention of refrigeration and freezers or the development of canning techniques for storing cultivated and foraged foods. Peppers can also be pickled or fermented, but in that case, they are not considered chilies. Chilies can be stored alone, dry, packed in oil, or salt. Sweet or hot, fresh peppers are seasonally available generally in late summer and early fall, unless they have been cultivated in a greenhouse. They are bundled and hung or laid out on screens to dry in the sun or in drying houses for packing and preservation. Chilies often are named for the region where they come from or the peoples who have historically foraged or cultivated them. When growing peppers, the hotter the weather, the hotter the pepper is able to become. Even a notoriously hot pepper will not reach its peak potential of heat if cultivated in a cooler environment. Peppers that are naturally sweet will be sweet in no matter what environment they are cultivated, unless the seeds were propagated from a plant that was cross-pollinated with a hot varietal. In this case, it will depend on dominant genetics and environmental conditions. In American cooking, chilies are also ground and mixed with other herbs and or salt to make seasonings, or soaked, stewed, and processed into sauces, pastes, and or chutney-style spreads. Salsa is most frequently made using fresh peppers, but chilies and chili powders are also sometimes used. Char-grilled peppers are often used as garnishes. I particularly like to char serrano peppers and then pack them in a jar with sesame oil, fresh garlic, cloves, and salt, then serve them like a pickle on a plate with my beans and rice. Peppers treated in this way can be kept in the refrigerator for up to 2 weeks. The oil and the garlic can also be used in other dishes, so nothing goes to waste. Making chili sauces is fun and delicious, even if a bit laborious. Once you have the technique down, you can make any number of different flavors. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. First, let's talk about making a pot of good old chili. Sure, you can put meat in yours if you like, but you don't need it. A bean and a grain makes a complete protein, so bake your loaf of masa bread and put on the pot of chili and you're good to go. But wait, first let's talk a little bit about beans. There are almost as many beans out there as there are chilies, and like chilies, what bean is used in a dish is largely dependent on the region. Of course, beans of all types are now grown all over the place, but every bean comes from somewhere. Myakoba beans are a popular bean from Peru. I met a nice woman and fellow artist named Gabriella from Peru many years ago when participating in a fundraiser during Lent for the Oakland Elizabeth House, a shelter for women and children escaping trafficking and other severe abuses. After getting to know each other a bit, she and I did a trade of artwork, one of my one-of-a-kind handmade sterling silver rings for one of her emotive portraits. Once a year, she traveled back to her native village in Peru for a month and painted portraits of women in the village. Many of the women she painted were traditional craftspersons and/or farmers. Black beans are notorious in Cuban cuisine. Pinto beans, red kidney, and garbanzo, chickpeas, are common in Central American and South American and Southwest. Or Central America and the American South and Southwest. Of course, there are many, many other varieties of heirloom beans in a rainbow of colors, sizes, and textures from all over the world. Flavors vary, but they all have one thing in common. They are very nutritious and packed with fiber. Of course, they must be paired with a grain in order to complete the protein, but now I'm starting to sound like a broken record. The only bean that is a complete protein without being paired with anything is the soybean, and the only grain with such a reputation is quinoa. When making a pot of chili, first figure out where the chilies you are using come from, and then pair them with beans from the same region. But really, at the end of the day, it's just a matter of taste. Use the beans and chilies you like and/or are available to you. I've even used fava and Asian adzuki beans in chili before. The only legumes I don't recommend using are lentils, peas, or mung beans. They aren't really suited for this dish, and they tend to cook down into a thick mush. This is greater if you are making harira, dal, or split pea soup, but not so desirable if you are making chili. Mung beans don't get mushy, but they will stand out in a way that is not pleasant in the chili. Mung beans are wonderful in kitchery and other Asian dishes, but are out of place in chili. Kitchery is an easy-to-make one-pot dish. It's kind of like an Indian chili, but the seasonings are nothing like chili of the Americas, and it has no peppers in it. Kitchery is made by sautéing equal amounts of dried mung beans and white basmati rice, it must be white basmati, in a generous amount of ghee in a deep, heavy pot. Then add lots of fresh ground ginger, turmeric, cinnamon, cumin, curry leaves, mustard seed and coriander, a diced yellow onion, medium-sized potato, and 2 stalks of celery with the leaves. Sauté until the onion starts to soften, then add enough water to cover the mixture with 2 inches. Once the beans, rice, and veggies are all tender, salt to taste, and add a handful of chopped fresh cilantro. It's wonderful for settling an upset stomach from indulgence or recovering from chemo treatments. But I digress. Back to chili. The sweetness, smokiness, or heat of your chili is dependent on the chilies you choose. There are so many different types of chilies. How do you know which ones are sweet, smoky, or spicy? Well, sometimes you just have to try them to know for sure. What is spicy to one person might not be to someone else, and a person does develop a tolerance to spice if it's part of their everyday diet. Years ago, I was making fried catfish po' boy sandwiches with fried peppers for dinner one night during the first Lenten season Omar and I were dating. He was living in an apartment with 2 of his fraternity brothers while on a work term. Omar did his undergrad studies at Kitchery University in Flint, Michigan. It is an accredited private university specializing in technology, particularly in the automotive industry. Their program is unusual by American standards in that it is an internship/co-op based program. For one term, students take classes, and for the next term, they work on an intern co-op basis for one of the partner companies. So Omar was on a work term, and I was making dinner. The peppers I was frying were a mix of fresh Hungarian wax peppers and Anaheim peppers, both sweet in flavor. But I also had 1 fresh habanero, or Scotch bonnet. At the time, I was not accustomed to preparing or eating many hot peppers. Just handling the habanero burned the skin on my hands to the point I soaked them in a bowl of milk. Milk is a base and neutralizes the heat of the pepper. These days, I can pop half a raw habanero in my mouth, and while my eyes may water, it's a tasty treat. Moral of the story is, if you are not accustomed to handling hot peppers or chilies, it is a good idea to wear gloves and be careful touching your face or using the bathroom. I don't know why my face is itching. Maybe it's this lipstick. It's a new lipstick. I might be allergic to it. For reference, the chart lists some different chilies you might find at the market and how hot they may be. I haven't listed the chili's Scoville rating because I don't have instruments to measure them myself, and besides, that scale only measures potential heat, not actual heat. Each individual pepper can vary in heat depending on cultivation conditions. The best way to know for sure is to taste them, as scary as that may sound. Now, I have a big chart of chilies here, and I have the name, the way they're prepared, some other information about them, and what the heat is commonly on them. So ones I have on here are habanero Scotch bonnet, a pinguica, tepin, pequin, morita, japonés, negro, guajillo, ancho, tostado, de árbol, Nuevo Mexico, and puya. Those are the chilies that, I mean, there's lots of other chilies. Lots and lots and lots and lots and lots, but those are just some that I have on here on chart. If you happen to find any of these chilies as fresh peppers, you can use a dehydrator to create chilies. You can certainly use them fresh as well, but there's a maturation of flavor that comes from the drying and or smoking process. Chilies are very high in vitamin C and have been used traditionally to treat joint pain and inflammation, as well as to keep the intestines parasite-free. I purchase most of my chilies at a farm stand on Highway 1 in Moss Landing, California, called Farm Fresh Produce. The other thing that will make your pot of chili extra delicious and super American is sourcing the right herbs. Coriander is the seed of the cilantro plant and is a must, but there are other herbs that can enhance your chili as well, such as the many varieties of sage, Hoya Santa, and epazote. You can find many of these plants growing wild in California, the American South and Southwest, Central and South America. All the different sages are frequently used as ornamentals and pollinator attractors in gardens and have lovely flavors and have a range of sage and have lovely flowers and a range of sage flavors, some floral and some more woody. Hoya Santa is an interesting herb that, once dried, has an aroma that smells a little like root beer. All of these herbs I am mentioning can be used in teas as well and have their own traditionally medicinal uses. Hoya Santa is said to even offer a slightly psychedelic effect if consumed in large quantities. I have never experienced this. I have used it in a blended tea. It has a delightful, sweet root beer-like flavor, but the only effect I can say I felt was a slight tingle on my tongue like an analgesic. Last summer, I had an epazote plant in my garden that grew like crazy. Drying the leaves and flowers, it yielded over a cup of ground herb. The flavor of epazote is pungent and distinct with an aroma that smells almost like gasoline, but not quite. It's most commonly used to flavor beans. Another spice you might look for is annatto seed paste or powder. It is known as chayote. Is known as chayote, but that can be confusing because there's a green pear-shaped squash-like vegetable that is known as chayote and is nothing like the spice. Chayote, annatto seed, is red in color and will lend a yellow to red hue to foods depending on how much you use. That red rice you get at a Mexican restaurant is chayote rice. It is not tomato paste like you may have thought. Chayote can be used to flavor pots of chili as well. In Santa Cruz, they have been having a chili cook-off in the fall for over a decade now. It's lots of delicious family fun on the boardwalk. Anyway, this is how I make my chili. Note, you need an Instant Pot or other pressure cooker if you are using the dried beans. Read the entire recipe before starting. Ingredients: half a stick of butter, half a cup of dried pinto beans or 1 can of pinto beans drained and rinsed, half a cup of dried kidney beans or 1 can kidney beans drained, half a cup dried Myakoba beans or 1 can undrained, 4 to 6 tablespoons of ground chilies, blend of your choice, hot or sweet, 1 fresh red bell pepper diced, 1 large red onion diced, 2 bay leaves, 1 tablespoon minced garlic, 1 teaspoon ground black pepper, half a teaspoon ground cumin, 1 tablespoon coriander, half a teaspoon ground epazote, half a teaspoon sage varietal of your choice, half a teaspoon ground dried Hoya Santa, half a quarter teaspoon chayote paste or powder, 5 sprigs fresh marjoram, 1 whole allspice ball, 2 whole cloves, 1 sprinkle of cinnamon, 2 carrots chopped, 2 stalks of celery chopped, 1 large potato cubed, 1 jar diced tomatoes plus 1 jar water and a jar of water for every half cup of dried beans used. Salt to taste, 1 cup frozen corn, optional if making masa bread, 1 teaspoon cocoa powder, optional, 1 bunch cilantro, chopped coarse, sour cream, cotija cheese. Put everything in the Instant Pot except for the cilantro, sour cream, and cheese. Then press the bean setting. If you don't have an Instant Pot or other pressure cooker, you can use a pot on the stove over medium-high heat, but you will need to use either all canned beans or soak your dried beans overnight. Beans that have been soaked should be drained and rinsed and will require more water while cooking in a conventional pot on the stove. It will also require being stirred every so often. You can begin by sautéing the spices and chilies in the butter until they are aromatic before adding everything else. If you are using dried and soaked beans in a conventional pot on the stove, you need to wait until the beans are tender before you add the tomatoes. Otherwise, like in the lentil soup, the acid from the tomatoes will keep your beans from ever getting as soft as they need to be. Once you add the tomatoes, bring it to a boil, then reduce the heat until the color begins to darken. My poor nose. Stir the cilantro through the chili before serving. Garnish with sour cream and cotija cheese. If you want to boost the vegetable content, you can also stir through 1 small zucchini cubed with the cilantro. Zucchini cooks quickly, especially when it is cubed. Serve with masa bread. This recipe serves up to 8. Finally, it's tamale time. Or is it? Traditionally, tamales are made for a summer festival, but so long as you have the ingredients, you can make and enjoy tamales anytime. Many people make them for holiday celebrations like Easter or Christmas, the way my family makes pierogi or ravioli. I guess everyone knows something stuffed is something special. Incidentally, in Silk Route cultures across the Mediterranean and Middle East, stuffed food items are called dolmas. That's what the word dolma means, stuffed. Most commonly, the term dolma is associated with grape leaves, but actually anything that is stuffed is a dolma, whether it's cabbage leaves, apples, squashes, or anything else. Tamales are interesting. Even tamales vary greatly based on the region where they are made. Usually tamales are made by stuffing a masa dough, different from Masa Bread dough, with a savory meat filling and wrapping it in a soaked, dried corn husk. Oh my God. I don't know. I'm going to have to put some Benadryl in my face or something. I don't know. My nose is just like, I'm allergic to something. I'm allergic to something. Yesterday my nose wasn't itching. Today my nose is itching like crazy. You know what? I used a new skincare product this morning too. It might be that. Because it was kind of tingling. I took it off. It was a skin mask. A face mask. I bet you that's what it is. I'm going to have to wash my face. Then they are steamed, but some regions wrap them in banana leaves and fill them with sweet fruit fillings like cherries or strawberries. This is congruent with pierogies. Most popularly, pierogies are stuffed with potato or cabbage, but some people stuff them with ground meats or dried fruits like prunes, apricots, or cherries. It depends on the local ingredients of the region and the customs, but we'll talk more about pierogies in the next chapter. We still have tamales to make. I learned to make tamales when we were living in Santa Rosa. It's really a very upsetting story for me to recall. I'm grateful for having learned such a special skill, but it was by accident and under circumstances where I, as well as the woman who taught me, were taken advantage of in a very dubious manner. My most sincere apology to Mrs. Raquel Montejo. I had no idea what Mr. Brandon McDonald had actually asked me to do, and I will never forgive him for his manipulation and lies. For the record, I fully agree with what I think you were trying to explain to me at the time. I think, perhaps, if language hadn't been such a barrier, I would have understood then. You were 100% justified in turning your back on him, the California Homemakers Association, and its membership. So at the time we were living in Santa Rosa, and I was seeking community and fellowship. My family wasn't interested in coming to visit often. They still aren't, as far as I can tell. In my family, if you choose to not have children, you are largely ignored. The majority of my family lives within driving distance of each other, and if you are out of sight, you are out of mind, unless you have children or are the one to call and make effort to be part of everyone's life. I was, at the time, still calling back to talk to everyone at least once a week, but it was becoming hurtful since no one called me or otherwise made effort to have a relationship with me unless they wanted to come buy California wines. So I was looking for something more local. I had quit attending church shortly after moving to California after a priest told me my marriage was an abomination because my husband wasn't a Christian. He told me this after meeting Omar after Easter services. I remember him asking Omar what kind of name Dahroug was and if he were Coptic. Omar didn't even know what Coptic meant. I had to explain it to him later when we got home. After interrogating Omar, Father Tim turned to me and asked me how we even got married in the church. I told him we hadn't only been married in the church, but had a full mass. He insisted that would have been an abomination. He used the word abomination. That means in offense of God. I assured him it had been approved by the bishop. After that Sunday, I refused to return to services. That experience had been in Sunnyvale, and now we were living in Santa Rosa. I was seeking new community. The Lenten season before we moved to Santa Rosa, I had received my first and second Reiki attunements and certifications and was open to exploring different types of community than I had been familiar with before. Omar and I were doing the majority of our grocery shopping at local farmers markets, and it was at one such market that I met Mr. McDonald selling calendars with pages emblazoned with beautiful paintings by contemporary artists. At the time, I didn't realize those artists were all exploited. Otherwise, I would have never continued talking to him, let alone purchase a calendar. Mr. McDonald was cadre for what he described as a local grassroots organization of members supporting members. The organization was called the California Homemakers Association. He said they were looking for volunteers to help with office work and doing medical and legal advocacy for the most at-risk, impoverished people in the community, all free of religious affiliation. As a young woman looking for community and activities of civic, moral, and ethical fortitude, not associated with the hypocrisy of religion such as I had experienced, this sounded perfect. So I started answering phones for them, filing paperwork, and editing newsletter articles once a week. Soon, I was accompanying non-English speakers with a translator to after-hours, 100% donated doctor's appointments as a patient's advocate and assisting elderly persons on fixed income who had their utilities shut off interact with utility companies to reinstate services. These things made me feel like I was helping people and I was meeting new and interesting folks and learning a little Spanish. However, many of the people I met out and about who weren't part of CHA wanted nothing to do with me once they learned I was associated with the group. Finally, someone told me they were a communist organization. I was shocked and disturbed. While I wished no harm on anyone, whatever their political affiliation, I wasn't interested in supporting any communist causes. I wasn't a communist. Half of my family had immigrated to this country to escape the oppression and cruelty of communism in Eastern Europe. I most certainly believed in the private ownership of property and the rights and autonomy of the individual. The next time I was in the office, I confronted Mr. McDonald about the allegations. He just laughed and said, "You ain't nothing if you ain't been called red." Then he assured me he was not a communist. Things went on like this for a while. I met a woman named Mariana Solis, who had once been a cook for a wealthy family in Mexico City. Oh. She and I did a lot of cooking for the office. Once a week, I'd make a large meal to take in. Those who did not have regular access to food were welcome to enjoy the meal. They had someone to cook most days of the week, plus the organization did food drives for members for holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas. Food was donated. More than once, Omar and I purchased dozens of turkeys for boxes that we then delivered personally to homes in the poorest neighborhoods. Like I said, it felt good to feel like we were helping people. Oh. Allergic. I'm going to have to wash my face. I didn't understand at the time that they were largely, not all, largely families of gang members, though I did know many people were undocumented and many family members who were not gang members were working dangerous jobs on farms and in construction. I just knew my friends, like Mariana, were kind, and I was learning things I would have never learned otherwise about California history and Latin American food and culture. Mariana and I shared recipes frequently. Then one day, Brandon called me with a new request. There was an annual tamale fundraiser coming up, and the woman who normally ran the kitchen refused to help. But for some reason, she told Brandon that she would teach me how to make the tamales. I had met Raquel Montejo a couple times at events, but we didn't really know each other. Brandon told me to go visit with her and gave me her number. I called Raquel, and we made a date for a few days later for me to come over to her apartment so she could show me how to make the tamales. I was excited to learn something new and maybe make a new friend. Raquel was only a couple years older than me, and I really didn't have any friends. I still don't. Raquel and I got along very well, though we belonged to different Christian faiths. We had love of Jesus and respect for our families in common. There was a bit of a language barrier since she wasn't totally fluent in English, and I spoke just a small amount of Spanish, but we managed. She taught me her family recipe for making pork and chicken tamales. Raquel was very well known in the area for her tamales, Both she and her husband worked in the food service industry. He was a cook in one of the more popular restaurants, and Raquel made tamales for 3 or 4 restaurants, including the one where her husband worked, as well as for a handful of street vendors. Her tamales were known as the best in Sonoma County. For a number of years, she had been helping CHA make them for an annual fundraiser. But this year she didn't want to. She explained to me that she had told Brandon she was too busy, but she really just didn't want anything to do with Brandon or the organization anymore. I was surprised and asked her why. She tried to explain to me, but we were both limited by language. The best she could convey to me was that she didn't think the organization fit with her beliefs as a Christian, that she didn't see herself separate from anyone from any ethnic group, and thought Brandon and CHA were racist. That's what she told me. It's a long story, but it was finally confirmed to me that the organization does in fact support the International Communist Party. Once I understood this, I turned away from them and haven't looked back. It's hard to believe I was so naive, not understanding what the National Labor Federation was. That's who received the funds from the sale of those beautiful calendars, the NLF, not the artists who made the beautiful paintings gracing the pages. While I am grateful for and respect the things I learned about the intimacies of border migration, immigration, agriculture, and California history, the price I have paid in harassment, criminal attack, and oppression that comes from turning your back on the families of gang members has cost way too much. And like I said, I'm not saying that everybody that I met there, that's what the case was, but there was a large percentage of people. When the weekend came for making the tamales for the fundraiser, the Mexican women who were working in the kitchen were very rude and treated me like an outsider. The meat from the first day went bad and festered. The pork was brought in last minute. New pork was brought in last minute, but it had been smuggled over the border with undocumented people from the farm in Oaxaca where the N1H1 virus originated. I have no idea how many people ended up getting sick, but I do know Omar and I almost died. Raquel was angry with me for betraying our friendship, and I didn't hear from her anymore, though we had spent a number of afternoons over a cup of tea laughing and sharing stories about our lives. She is the friend who prayed with me when my paternal grandmother had her massive stroke. Raquel supported me in my decision to spend that month with my grandmother while she was adjusting to her new body and life. I am grateful to Raquel for her friendship and support at that time. There is only one other friend I can say I have ever had who was as good and supportive, and that's Emily Edie. It's been years since I have heard from her either. Hindsight is 20/20, and at least now I know better. CHA was pretty oppressive. They were part of the problem, not the solution, and I would pity Mr. McDonald if I thought he were mentally ill, but I don't think he is. I think he's simply selfish and manipulative. My grandmother had her stroke on the 3rd Sunday of Lent. I know this not because I remember the day, but because I have her missal and her bookmark was on that page. She followed her missal daily. I used to do the same, but after everything I experienced in Cursillo community and the greater church communities in Oakland and every other time I've tried to engage faith community of any type, not just Catholic, I now prefer to simply observe my faith in my own ways. It's why I'm writing this today. After all, Vatican II taught me that ultimately faith comes down to 2 things, personal relationship with Jesus and the right of my own conscience. The tamales Raquel taught me to make were pork filled with a de arbol sauce and chicken in a verde tomatillo sauce, and the masa was made with lard. Yes, I still know how to make them that way, but those are her family recipes, and besides, I'm predominantly a lacto-ovo vegetarian now. I make a similar de arbol sauce, but instead of pork, I use cactus and cheese, or fermented peppers and carrots, and cheese in mine. But you'll see, we're getting there. First, let's talk about making pepper sauce. Pepper sauces are as diverse as pepper varietals are diverse, and cultures all over the globe make some variation. Used as condiments, sauces, or ingredients in more elaborate dishes, pepper sauces are a wonderful way to add layers of delicious exotic complexity to bland palates. Pepper sauces can be thin, thick, chunky, gelatinous, jellied, reduced, hot, sweet, salty, tart, and everything in between. There are 2 big things to decide upon when making a pepper sauce: seeds and skins versus no seeds and skins, and fresh versus preserved peppers. The choice comes down to the intended uses and applications of the finished product. For the past 15 years, Omar and I have made the majority of our Christmas gifts. We've done this for a few reasons. First, nothing says I love you like something handmade. Oh my God, I should just stop and go wash my face. It's terrible. I can smell the product that I used. It had a perfume in it, and it's probably that perfume because I'm allergic to all kinds of scents. I should have known when I took it out of the package and I could smell it. I should have just thrown it away. Nothing says I love you like something handmade. Also, I don't like buying crap for just the sake of buying crap. I like to use my dollar to support businesses, causes, and communities I believe in. Then, of course, when you make something for someone, you can customize easily. And finally, it's easier to control your budget when you make things yourself. The first year we made our gifts, we made pepper jelly, apple butter, and blended herbal teas. The peppers came from a vendor we had gotten to know at the farmer's market. The apples came from the apple tree in our yard. And the herbs came from a well-known and internationally respected apothecary, Rosemary's Garden in Sebastopol, California. I had learned about the apothecary after reading Herbal Healing for Women and Rosemary Gladstar's Medicinal Herbs, A Beginner's Guide by its founder, Rosemary Gladstar, a well-known and widely respected herbalist. Wow, this chapter is shaping up to be quite long, but the information is all pertinent and good, so I'll let it roll, I guess. Anyway, I think I will stop here and finish reading in another clip after I wash my face. My cheeks itch too. Like I said, I can smell that product. Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. I'll never use it again.